And he has an important seminar to teach at about 2 o'clock. So he'll be here for the first half, kind of managing the 1 to 2, and then Patricia will be more or less managing 2 to 3. All right. Oh, and a question for the two of you. As you are going through your lecture, we always ask about the question format. If you would like students to jump in during your lecture to be asking questions, or just if you prefer that they like submit them and kind of wait till the end. And either way, we have John, Nicole, Santiago, and Jeffrey prepared some questions in advance. So we'll have those to like get started after the lecture.
I'd say for me, like clarifying questions along the way are totally fine, and more discussion-oriented questions, I'll definitely try to leave time at the end of my part for that.
Right on.
And I designed my part. I maybe missed the memo that we were preparing a lecture. So my entire part is conceived of as discussion oriented and interactive. So I will be sharing a few slides and some sound clips of Maria Sabina herself. But yeah, very much the second hour will be very conversational between us and interactive.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, I'll just get into your bios then, and then we'll transition to the meditation. All right, so Sam Shonkoff is a professor of Jewish studies at the GTU in Berkeley, and his scholarship focuses on modern Jewish spirituality and culture, particularly German Jewish, Hasidic, and Neo-Hasidic contexts. He taught previously at Oberlin College. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. He's also affiliated with the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics, where he works primarily on the BCSP GTU partnership. Patricia, also from Berkeley, is writing her dissertation, or her dissertation is about the contemporary revival of psychedelics as medicine in the United States, and more specifically about healing practices in this revival that do not presume a biomedical model of understanding illness and cure. These sensory-rich practices include honoring the dead, building altars, energy work, creating connections with the earth and the cosmos, and different kinds of body-centered techniques of healing. This revival also takes place in the context of a moment of reckoning and reflection in American society as to its settler colonial origins and how legacies of racism and white supremacy continue to shape our society at all levels, including our criminal justice and medical systems, our university, our understanding of the nature of reality, our conceptions of religion and spirituality, and our ways of relating to our bodies, ourselves, and each other. And I didn't mention, but Patricia is a PhD student studying socio-cultural anthropology at UC Berkeley. So with that, Sam, if you'd like to take us away for the meditation.
My pleasure. Hi, all. Good to see you. So let's begin just grounding. I love that you start these with meditations. So I invite everyone to close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that. And just bring some awareness to the body. We're going to be staying with the body as much as we can over these next couple minutes. Just feel the parts of your self that are in contact with other surfaces. Maybe your feet with a floor. Maybe you're sitting on a surface. What surface is your hand touching? Bring some attention to the breath. Not because it's necessarily magical or unique in some way, but just as an anchor for our attention. Something that's always changing, but as long as we're alive, always there. And as our awareness and our awareness of awareness starts to settle and move to the forefront of our attention, I want us to also bring some mindfulness to the flitting thoughts that accompany all consciousness, all awareness. What does that feel like? We're constantly interpreting phenomena, whether it's physical sensation or sensations of emotions in our bodies, or smells, or sounds, or thoughts themselves. We have this remarkable tendency to label, to judge and evaluate, to reflect upon. And right now, I don't want us to try to fight that tendency of mind, but really just to bring some attention to it. To the ways in which our interpretations of stimuli, our interpretations of phenomena, our mental responses to phenomena always seem to accompany whatever immediate raw sensation we experience. And to bring some attention to that fact of interpreting, of translating phenomena into mind, into language, is already a profound point of realization, of awareness, to see that we're doing that. Now I want to invite us to go even a little deeper into this awareness. And to bring an intention to this moment right now, to try our best to just perceive. To just perceive on a bodily, palpable, sensory, physical level, the breath, sound, body, air, but already those are just words and labels. What does it mean to actually just perceive? Let's take another 2 breaths together. I invite you to open your eyes when you're ready. Welcome back. So I wanted to begin today with an awareness of interpreting. Just to start to bring some attention to the fact that we are always already hermeneutical beings, as it's called in the highbrow term. We are always interpreting beings. If we even have moments of a kind of pure perception, whatever that would even mean exactly, those are fleeting, remarkable exceptions to the rule. And that's not a bad thing. I think there's something that can actually be enchanting and awakening about this mindfulness of this human tendency. And it directs our attention to the fact that there are many realities, right? Based on our own bodily, cultural, biographical, environmental conditions at any given moment. Nature and nurture, history, everything. We are interpreting the stimuli of being, the stimuli of existence, of world, in very particular ways. And the spectrum of possible perceptions, in as much as perceptions are always interpretations of the kind of raw, elusive data of being, there can be radically different realities, radically different worlds. Psychedelics are one way that some people are awakening to this fact. When we alter the brain as normally functioning as a kind of prediction machine, right, based on what we imagine to be the world, and open our senses in different ways, what Rachel Peterson called ontological insurgencies can happen, right? We can be flooded with a sense of a different window into reality. But psychedelics certainly aren't the only way to do this. And I'm always struck as a scholar of religion, as a historian of religion, looking back at sources that we might be tempted to just say, oh, that person is lying, right? Or that person is having a hallucination. But actually recognizing that when we look into different cultures, into different times, reality looks different. It looks radically different. And so to recognize that there is something that's mysterious, that's elusive, that's beneath what is knowable, what is familiar, what is predictable, is itself something that that I want us to kind of hold in mind for where we're going today. Like was already said, I'm going to need to leave it to teach at 2 o'clock, and I wish that Patricia and I could just sort of like be in conversation for this whole time. But I'm going to sort of facilitate the first half. Patricia's going to facilitate the second half. But what we're bringing, or as you said from the readings, is going together. So I want to begin thinking about religious studies and the place of religious studies in psychedelic studies. And I'm thinking, given the work I'm doing right now, of especially thinking about like, what does it mean that there is a partnership emerging between the Graduate Theological Union, where I teach, a block away from UC Berkeley's campus, and the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. I think that's actually a very significant thing that's happening right now, and I want us to think about the place of religion and spirituality in psychedelics, and what the field of religious studies brings to that conversation. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that there has been, in as much as psychedelics are getting a ton of brain scientists and policymakers to talk about mysticism and religious experience, it's pretty remarkable how like generally absent scholars of religion have been in that discourse. And there's a few things that I want to highlight about kind of what it might mean for academic religious studies to enter this conversation in ways that historically it hasn't. One piece is, and we'll speak about this more in a moment, but one of the kind of tenets of academic religious studies is if there is any like essential religious experience, right? If there's any transcultural, transhistorical, transgeographical, like mystical experience as such, or spiritual experience as such, if there is such a thing, it is infinitely elusive. It is incredibly difficult to identify such a thing if we really are taking seriously a historical attunement to the diversity of these things that we call religious phenomena throughout the world and throughout history. And we'll say more about that soon. Scholars of religion are also, what we do essentially is think about what is called in psychedelic studies set and setting, right? Where set is how one's personal background, one's personal dispositions and positionality shape one's experience, and setting, ways that immediate environment, including the ritual and performed embodied elements of the circumstance, the music, the gestures, who's there, right? This is the stuff of religion. Ways in which certain kinds of experiences, certain modes of consciousness are shaped and catalyzed through particular techniques, in particular bodies, in particular communities and spaces. So just for example, for me as a scholar primarily in the field of Jewish studies within religion, in terms of some of my research on that pertain to psychedelics, I'm interested in looking at how a particular spiritual movement known as Neo-Hasidism, this is people who are Jews who are drawing upon a particular mystical movement that emerged in 18th century Eastern Europe. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but looking at ways that Hasidic sources and practices actually mediate experiences with LSD and psilocybin, and also vice versa, right? Ways that those experiences then in turn shape those sources and transform Hasidism itself. There is no psychedelic experience as such, and as scholars of religion, we're really sensitive to this fact, and there's a lot to be explored there in the field of psychedelic studies that sometimes gets underappreciated. Also, maybe surprisingly, I'm finding that that religious studies actually offers some sobriety and words of caution. At times, maybe some would think it would be the opposite, that if anyone is going to have a more kind of like woo-woo perspective on psychedelics between neuroscientists and scholars of religion, that it might be the latter. But I think that if there's one thing that the critical historical study of religion unveils, it's that every enchanting and revelatory movement in human history, right, no matter how luminous the auras of that movement are, is nonetheless human. We see dynamics of power enter. We see assumptions and violence, and without exception, in the entire history of what we can see about any spiritual movement, it's going to be human, and that is true for this one as well. And these different ways, I'm not suggesting that religious studies needs to have like just a deconstructing, disenchanting posture here, but rather one of actually expanding a sense of what's possible and approaching with a kind of awe, in the twofold sense of that word. Awe as in like wondrous excitement, right? What is happening in this field? And when we're looking at psychedelics and the experiences that accompany these medicines, it is wondrous, but also the other side of awe, of a kind of humility, of fear, in a sense that this is actually powerful. These substances are powerful. Spiritual movements are powerful, and they can do tremendous good and they can do tremendous harm. And how do we seize our agency and our intentionality and our wisdom and our humility as individuals, as communities, to explore this? I'll also just say that while many of us are interested in questions of like historical uses of sacramental plants and fungi, and ways that those have played roles, sometimes hidden roles, in the history of different religious traditions, that's not necessarily like the great interest of religious studies. As somebody myself who focuses mainly on modern spiritualities, modern religious thoughts, I'm actually like kind of interested in the fact that for an increasing number of people today in the 21st century, it's apparently unimaginable that these prophetic traditions and mystical traditions emerged without chemical interventions in this way, right? Like the fact that that has become so unimaginable to us increasingly in our society, I think is fascinating in itself. So those are in terms of some of the like discussions and topics where at this intersection of religious studies and psychedelic studies. Another piece of this partnership between the GTU and the Berkeley Center, and a place for more exploration in religious studies and psychedelic studies more broadly is in psychedelic guidance and integrating techniques from chaplaincy and spiritual care. So the GTU has a really awesome program, an interreligious chaplaincy program, drawing primarily from the Centers for Islamic Studies, Jewish Studies, and Dharma Studies, but also broader beyond that. And we're developing a program that will be based at UC Berkeley in psychedelic guidance, specifically for chaplains and religious leaders, at least in the first incarnation of this program. And looking at ways like how can the kind of attunement to cultural diversity, different religious backgrounds, and interpretive frameworks, drawing upon religious traditions and different spiritual traditions around preparation, ritual, and integration processes after having profound transformative experiences. Looking at that intersection will be really fruitful ground. So I'm gonna launch in now to a piece that I've already started mentioning a bit, but want to flesh out a little more. And then I want to make sure also in 15 minutes or so to make sure to leave some room for questions before I have to depart. And I imagine this term has come up before, but the main term I want to talk about right now is perennialism. Perennialism generally in this context is the idea that, again, there is some perennial, transcultural, transhistorical, like essence of religious experience or mystical experience or spiritual experience, whatever we call it. And right, even outside of this particular context, whenever someone uses the word essence, right, we should furrow our brows a little bit, right? We talk a lot today about like essentializing people or essentializing cultures. We should have the same kind of critical sensitivity to essentializing experiences in ways that mask the particularities, the diversities, the different positions and perspectives that are possible and that get sort of hierarchized and marginalized and privileged and so on. So this perennialism has been a profound problem in psychedelic studies, in all of its waves in the sort of scientific psychedelic studies communities. We see this famously, blatantly in, for example, the book, The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley in 1945, and this idea that there is this kind of mystical core that is perennial, right? That is unchanging across time and space in human history. We see it also in the current wave. So for example, and I'll share my screen here for a moment. Everyone can see this? Great. So this was the landmark 2006 paper out of Johns Hopkins that in many ways inaugurated like this so-called second wave of psychedelic research. And we can see ways, this is specifically looking at generation of mystical experiences. Perhaps some people have seen this paper already. And I want to just note, and the metrics that are being used here for thinking about mystical experience. This is called the Pankey-Richards Mystical Experience Questionnaire. And let's see in the scientific article how this is discussed. This is the questionnaire that was given to the subjects of this study to measure their mystical experiences. So we see this questionnaire is based on the classic descriptive work on mystical experiences and the psychology of religion by Walter Stacey of 1960. So you can see, like, it's not to say that older scholarship is always bad, but I can tell you that the field of religious studies has had a lot of really important insights since 1960 in Stacey's work. So I'll continue. And it provides scale scores for each of 7 domains of mystical experiences. And okay, so these are the domains of mystical experience, according to this study. Internal unity, that is pure awareness, emerging with ultimate reality. External unity, unity of all things are alive, all is one. Transcendence of space and time, ineffability and paradoxicality, that is the claim of difficulty in describing the experience in words, a sense of sacredness or awe, a noetic quality, that is a claim of intuitive knowledge of ultimate reality, right? There's like some sense that you take away some sort of knowledge or understanding from this experience. And finally, the 7th is a deeply felt positive mood, joy, peace, and love. So before we take this apart, I want to also approach this with some humility and acknowledge that if you are trying to study mysticism, mystical experience scientifically, maybe you have to come up with some kind of rubric. Right? Maybe you have to come up with some definition. But I want us to be attentive today to ways in which any effort to do that on some level is going to be faulty. It's going to be limited. And so with this one in particular, I just want to highlight a couple things. First of all, the first 2 of these 7 dimensions of so-called mystical experience are about unity, a sense of oneness. This is, of course, a tremendous privileging of a particular kind of experience. And I know that we all read this excerpt of Maria Sabina's oral autobiography, and I want to just make some references to her testimonies, to her reflections, just to help sensitize us to the fact that this definition of mystical experience is far from universal. This definition of a kind of peak psychedelic experience is tremendously limited. So first of all, the description just simply isn't universal. Maria Sabina herself, as you saw a bit of, she really like doesn't speak about oneness and unitive experiences, right? Like really not at all. And certainly in terms of the seventh criterion in the Pankey-Richards mystical questionnaire, that it's a pleasant experience, one of peace, joy, or love. Some experiences that Maria Sabina describes that we see are terrifying, are haunting, or at the very least don't necessarily have this kind of like positive, radiant valence to it. So first of all, right, it's just simply not universal. It's also, of course, highly selective, right? This emphasis on unitive experiences, this emphasis on awe and moments of transcendence and ineffability and peacefulness and joy. What about the other experiences? Right? In all of these studies, we hear from the testimonies, from the trip reports, that there's also lots of other kinds of experiences. There's moments of fear. There's moments of visitation or vision of shapes, of ancestors, of places, of people, of textures. Why are those less significant? And when we look again at Maria Sabina's own testimonies, this master curandera, this master healer and teacher with these medicines, we see that she emphasizes different elements of her experience, right? She will often emphasize specifically these moments of vision, of visitation, encounters with saints, animals, ancestors, places, and so on. So how do we decide what gets privileged as essential and what gets marginalized or perhaps even judged as superfluous or somehow inessential? Another issue that I just want to point out with this essentializing of mystical experience is the total inattention to matters of set and setting. And this, I just have to say, and it's important, at least from the perspective of my field, but also I think for ethical reasons, to note that this particular perspective on mysticism that we saw, for example, in the Pankey Richards questionnaire, drawing on this kind of perennialism, is that it's deeply Protestant. It reflects a deeply Protestant Christian sensibility. And I could go off on for hours on what exactly that means, but for our present purposes, to say that Protestantism, that movement of the Reformation that became, in a sense, the spirituality of modern liberalism, of modern capitalism, and splitting from Catholicism, partly on the sense that all of the sort of trappings of religion, the wafer and wine, the communion, the baptism, that all of these are actually just symbolic, and that true religiosity, true spirituality is to tap into the immaterial, spiritual, intellectual essence of all of those things, and that is what true religiosity looks like. That was part of the ethos of this thing that we call Protestantism in the Reformation. And we see here, right, in this very white, often Christian or sort of post-Christian secular essentializations of mysticism, surprise, surprise, it reflects this deeply Protestant structure of what spirituality and the essence of religion ought to look like. And that is not a coincidence. And that is also inseparable from an entire thorny history of colonialism and the measuring of other people's religions, practices, and traditions in relation to this rubric out of the traditions of Protestantism of what counts as genuine religiosity. Lastly, I just want us to note, thinking even beyond Protestantism into a kind of modern individualism, that this perennialism, right, that we see in the Pankey Richards questionnaire, it places the individual at the epicenter of this drama that we call mysticism. Yes, even when we talk about ego dissolution as the essence of this experience, that is about my ego. That is telling me that what happens to my ego, to my sense of self, is really where the rubber hits the road, right? That's where the action's at. That's what's meaningful. That's what's significant. And again, we can look at Maria Sabina's writings here and just see like a radically different approach to this. She is taking the saint children, right? The mushrooms to heal other people. This isn't about, evidently, her own experiences. It's not about her own self-dissolution into the oneness and the great nothingness of all reality. It's functional. It's external. It's intersubjective. And I find this one moment in her testimony so fascinating. I just want us to like look at it together. And I'm sorry that this document is so damn blurry, but she's referring. This is at the end of the excerpt that we read, where she talks about Gordon Wasson, right? This white guy from the United States who very famously, and Patricia's going to get more deeply into this, kind of comes and so-called, discovers psychedelic mushrooms in this indigenous community in Mexico. And she's reflecting on this in a way that I find so illuminating. She says, after those first visits of Wasson, many foreign people came to ask me to do vigils for them. I asked them if they were sick, but they said no, that they had only come, quote, to know God. They brought innumerable objects with which they took what they call photographs and recorded my voice. Later, they brought papers, newspapers, and magazines in which I appeared. I've kept some papers I'm in. I keep them even though I don't know what they say about me. It's true that Wasson and his friends were the first foreigners who came to our town in search of the saint children, and that they didn't take them because they suffered from any illness. Their reason was that they came to find God. Before Wasson, nobody took the mushrooms only to find God. The little mushrooms were always taken for the sick to get well. So these final words here in this statement, I think, have to raise the question for us of what do we mean when we're talking about spirituality? Right? What do we mean when we're talking about what spiritual experience looks like? For Maria Sabina, she was deeply pious, she talks a lot about God. She talks a lot about the saints. I'm not trying to draw like oversimplistic sort of black and white binaries between these things. But she notes that Wasson and the others sort of from his sphere who enter these practices are coming at it with this particular kind of spirituality that's about their own seeking of God, that is about their inner experience. And I want us to just dwell in the question of what is spirituality, right? And what I hope, just from these kind of opening remarks here, from the perspective of my field of religious studies, is again, not just to disillusion and disenchant, but actually to just break things open, to try to complicate in order to see like a kind of vastness, that actually the spectrum of possible spiritual experiences is vaster than our wildest dreams. And to ignore that fact, I'd say, not only has spiritual consequences, but also has ethical and political consequences. So I'll stop there, and in the few minutes I have remaining, really curious to hear any questions or concerns or comments that are out there.
Thanks very much, Sam. That was great. Yeah, and so like I was saying before, John, Nicole, Santiago, and Jeffrey had some questions prepared, and so just welcome to them to jump in, and then to anyone else for whom that brought something up.
Hey, Sam. So I've got a question on, I guess, well, we talk about these schools of thought, I guess, and they have those people went to find God with Sabina, and they didn't necessarily know, say, the cultures of these people or how they interact in their community. For me, I often find spirituality in community, working with others. So those people obviously had a deeper connection with the land, etc., that is different than with what whatever the guy's name was, I'm sorry. But my question comes down to, how do we connect mysticism with, say, gender and stuff like that? Like, as I'm a non-binary person, so I don't necessarily fit in the gender binary of like male or female. So I don't always feel connected to everyone. But I do feel connected to the earth. I feel like a part of it, and I always will feel like a child of the Earth Mother. So it's like, how do we connect mysticism with that? Because I don't see a lot of talks about it and things like that, or at least what's your interpretation?
Thank you so much. It's such a great question. So yeah, I'll leap to the gender piece there, and there's so many different ways, directions I want to go with it, but I'll try to be really brief. Like all discourses, they have that have been going on for centuries, particularly in the context that we tend to be steeped in, and in Western religious traditions and in the academy and so on. They've been dominated by patriarchy and have been largely discourses by and for men. And that is true in many mystical traditions and theological traditions and so on, of course. And that has eclipsed different experiences of different people with different gender identities throughout history. And furthermore, just in terms of the perennialism piece and how it links in with these questions of gender, the very terms and concepts of mystical experience, of spirituality, have been so historically gendered. And this is in Christianity and Islam and Judaism, drawing from Greek philosophy, going back deep into antiquity, where mostly men have imagined the intellect, spirit, mind, and so on to be masculine, and have imagined corporeality, materiality, feeling to be somehow feminine. And I just want to highlight how, from that perspective, we could critique the kind of perennialism I was talking before from a gender, through the lens of gender as well, right? This privileging of the transcendent, this privileging of the transcendence of body, the transcendence of language, the transcendence of anything material, corporeal, as the essence of mystical experience, is in itself to privilege what has historically been a so-called masculine mode of mysticism. Now, today, we of course need to go a step further to deconstruct the gender binary altogether and the essentializing of gender that even presupposes this idea of masculine spirituality and feminine corporeality. But that can draw our attention even further, again, to just this unimaginable diversity of possible experiences in spiritual life, and ways that we can see in very just blatant tragic ways that has been gendered in ways that have rendered different kinds of experiences invisible or inferior in some way. And so I think a lot of our work today in psychedelic studies and beyond, just in our world, could be what do our contemporary critical perspectives on gender and on identity more broadly, what kind of new vistas does that open up for thinking about the fecundity and the vastness of spirituality in ways that have been eclipsed in the past?
All right, thank you very much for your response.
Thank you. I can take one more. I really don't want to leave. I can take one more before I have to go teach.
Okay, if no, does anyone else have a question, or can I ask mine? Okay, well, I was wondering, just going off of what you were just talking about, if like what would examples be of more feminine traits in like mystical experiences or psychedelic experiences, and is there a way to focus more on those feminine traits that haven't been like overly gendered?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So yeah, I mean, this relates to the first one. Again, I personally don't want to affirm the ways in which historically different kinds of mystical experiences, spiritual experience have been typed as like either sort of masculine type or feminine type. But in response to your question, for example, I'm thinking right now of Saint Teresa d'Avila in the Catholic tradition, a female mystic whose experiences were characterized above all by certain feelings, right, affects in the body, in the heart, and also by visions, vivid, palpable, erotic, and bloody, grotesque sometimes visions, right, of Jesus, of the crucifixion, of the blood, of the body. This would be contrasted with kind of what gets dubbed as a sort of quintessentially masculine Christian mysticism of someone like Meister Eckhart, right, who's tapping into some sort of transcendent oneness. So again, without necessarily affirming the attribution of masculinity or femininity, like as a sort of typology, I think a lot of us probably want to get beyond that, but noting that that we might that not privileged, because we don't necessarily want to create a hierarchy, but we might want to be very careful about ways that we do have tendencies or see tendencies to privilege the sort of out-of-body experiences, the unitive experiences of oneness and dissolution and so on, over experiences of visions of people and places and shapes and things, of particular feelings in the body and so on. I think that actually, even if we aren't always explicitly talking about gender and patriarchy and misogyny, if we expand our discourses of mysticism and spirituality to be more reflective of the diversity of possible experiences in this way, that actually is a work of dismantling those forces of patriarchy and misogyny that have exerted such control over our discourses of mysticism.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have to run and teach, but I'm thrilled for you to learn with Patricia now. And thank you all so much. And I'll just put my email here. Feel free to be in touch if you have any other questions. And I love that you guys are doing this, and can't wait to hear more. So goodbye.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Bye. Have a good class.
All right.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. That was much too short, and I am very happy to be here with you all, and just wanted to suggest that for a moment, invite you all to take. I know that when there's a transition from one kind of rich set of things to going into another piece of something, that it often can be good just to take a little pause and kind of take in what we've already had. So I invite you all to just for a minute, 30 seconds, a minute, jot down something that you learned, something that was meaningful, something that you were curious about from Sam's presentation. And you're welcome to turn off your video if you'd like to do that. And we will come back together and transition into what I'll lead in the discussion in a moment. But until just for 30 seconds, a minute, I invite you all to kind of digest, integrate what Sam shared, and write a note or two about it. Okay, everyone, welcome back. And I just want to check, is the volume a bit better now?
I can hear you well.
Okay, all right, thank you, thank you. So again, I'm very happy to be here. It's a privilege to be here, and I just want to say hello. I do know some of you from being your GSI at Berkeley and various classes, and also being part of a mentorship, a psychedelic mentorship program. So it's good to see some familiar faces here. Hello, everyone. And as was introduced, I'm a PhD student in the sociocultural anthropology program at UC Berkeley, and I'm trained in psychological anthropology and the anthropology of religion. And some of the professors on campus that have been very important to me are Stefania Pandolfo and Charles Hirschkin in the anthropology department, and David Presti in the molecular and cellular biology department, and also psychology department. They're on my committee. And for those of you who are familiar with their work, you'll see the influences here. So one of the important bridges, I think, from Sam's presentation to what I wanted to talk to you about today and engage us in a conversation around has to do with the legacies of colonialism, and seeing colonialism broadly here as an expansion, as an imperial project, right? An expansion of empire out of Europe into Africa, Asia, the Americas, and so forth, a global imperial project. But one that was also connected to science, the production of knowledge, and even our understanding of the nature of reality and what is real and what is true religiosity or true spirituality. And so, you know, along with the colonial project went a kind of comparative project of which anthropology and really all of the disciplines of our modern university were a part of in some way. And in terms of the study of religion, the kind of practice of religiosity, you know, the colonial project involved a measuring, a comparing of in particular, Protestant and Catholic traditions against other traditions. And this is very much what Gloria Anzaldúa is writing about in the chapter Entering the Serpent that I asked you to read. So we'll get to that. But both Sam and I invited you to read and think about Maria Sabina, this healer from a small town in the Sierra Mazateca region of Oaxaca, where Gordon Wasson came in the 1950s in search of psychoactive mushrooms. And he wanted to do a ceremony, he wanted to try the mushrooms. And you read in the autobiographical notes that Sam shared with you how it came to be that Maria Sabina did a ceremony of Alada with Wasson. And then after Wasson did this ceremony, he had with him, I think he came back another time, and he recorded Sabina, he photographed her, he photographed the ceremony, and recorded vocal selections of her recitation of her ceremony. And he published an account in Life magazine in the end of the 1950s. And this is how the magic mushroom came to the world through that Life magazine issue. And there were intense consequences for the town, as Maria Sabina also writes about, that tourists began to come to this small town in Oaxaca and other parts of Oaxaca, Timothy Leary included. And this created, you know, as you read about perhaps in Pasha Thawdry's article, a very intense transformation of life in this community. The Jimenez, which continues to this day, continues to be a tourist hub, and in ways that profoundly shape and affect life for the indigenous community there. And so I imagine this as a much more kind of interactive time I will show a few slides um, to just give us a bit more visuals and a soundscape. I wanted you to be able to hear Maria Sabina, her voice. And there were many recordings taken of her in ceremony, healing people. And so I'm going to share my screen now. This is Maria Sabina. And maybe let me put on the slideshow from the current slide. Here we go. And we'll get to this in a moment. Some of the recitation, which she was very famous for, and there were many ethnomusicologists who were very interested in her style of singing, reciting. But this again is an image of her, and that date is wrong. I'll fix that. I believe it was 1884. She lived quite a long life. And this is an image of the community where she was born and raised, Pueblo de Jeminas in Oaxaca, Mexico. And I'll just quickly share that there was a long tradition of using psychoactive mushrooms in the Americas. This is an image of Aztec practice of using mushrooms that was documented in the 16th century, around the time when the Spanish came to the New World. And these are mushroom stones from Guatemala. Many of you, I'm sure, know, and the Pasha Foundry's article discusses this a little bit. There was a violent, the conquest of the New World was incredibly violent. Many indigenous healers were tortured, burned, accused of witchcraft, sorcery, and of associating with the devil. And as you can see in this image, there was an association of the mushroom and practices around the mushroom as satanic practices. And so they were violently suppressed by the Spanish. In certain places, though, traditions of using the mushroom survived, including this town, Huautla de Jeminas. And just going back to this town. It's a mountainous town, it's not easy to reach. And so it survived, and a syncretic tradition of healing was born. As you saw from the reading that Sam gave, the mushrooms are known as Niños Santos, saint children. And Maria Sabina, the way she spoke about the healing that happened through her was that she would consume the mushrooms, and then a libro, in Spanish, a book, would appear. And the saints, God, Cristo, Christ, would speak through her. And the role of Mary, the Virgin of Guadalupe, in this practice is very important. And you read a bit more about that in Enzo Dula's piece on embracing the serpent. And this practice that Maria Sabina had, and it still continues in this place, is also one of combining pre-Columbian indigenous traditions. Use of plants like San Pedro for protection and also to encourage release, including vomiting, spitting, and so forth. There's sucking, extractions, which are common healing practices throughout the Americas and shamanic traditions. There's sacrifices of small animals, and also, as you read, the kind of understanding of exchange is through small gifts, a few pesos, maybe giving some concentrated alcohol. This is the aguardiente, but it is a non-commercialized practice done among neighbors. This is an excellent documentary about Maria Sabina's life. Here is an image of the Life magazine article about Sabina, and this is an image of Gordon Wasson. Again, as I said, there are quite intense consequences for Maria Sabina. There was a visiting of many hippies in Spanish, hippies, American English, British English. This is an image of the hippies coming to the town that were from all over the Spanish-speaking world as well as the English-speaking one. There were many Mexican hippies that came as well. And again, Larry was someone, he didn't visit this town, but he visited Oaxaca. And that's where he took mushrooms for the first time. So there's a very complicated legacy that resulted from this, that again, Pasha Faldry in that article is writing about. And today the town is still very much a tourist destination. Here, this is a taxi, the mushrooms on the side of the taxi, and this is the entrance to the town. It says welcome in Spanish, and the mushrooms. This is the special church of the mushrooms that was built. And the government has had a very sort of complicated relationship too. They arrested Maria Sabina, they've arrested other healers in the town. In the last 20 years or so, the government's tune, the national government and the local government have really shifted, and they've really come to celebrate the town and Maria Sabina and the place of the healers there in a different way in order to attract tourists. So there's many complicated legacies and consequences for the town. So I want to, and we can talk about that a bit more. I wanted you though to have an experience of listening to her. So I am, let me set this up. I'm gonna get into, I hope that you can still, can you tell me, someone unmute, can you still see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I am going to start this recitation, and then we can follow along with the slides for a few minutes.
Thôn chung ga thô sinh chung ga thôn lên chung tô sinh này chung tô sinh chỉ công hàng cây sâu xì chung ga vang say chung ga vang xa chung ga cô càng khang cô ngang ga em cô ngang mang cha cô suy đi tổ cô ăn ga sen cô ngang đi trên esto no García se va a hacer tú sin nada chonga thô sinh chonga thô nè ha kê sô si 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 so chong vô si xia chong sa bebro chong sa bao lô ha kê sô si chong ga libro chong lên nhau xiang chong lên nhau pro chong lên nhau xiao ha kê sô si chong ga lô nang chong ga liu nang chong ga lô nang chong an gan thanh chong ga san yong chong ga libro ha kê sô si so chong sa se nai chong sa se ngi chi kong chong ga sa se ga ro ha kê sô si so chong ga thô sinh chong ga thô nè chong ga kristro chong ga kristro so chong ga to ki chong ga sa ki chong nan ra yong chong kha sai nai chong ga ri long so
Accendi aspetta tu sale chi aspetta
Si 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 so sa 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 si 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 so sa 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 si so 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 non c'è.
So that is her voice, and that is her on the mushrooms in the midst of a ceremony. And I wanted you to be able to hear her and get a sense of what it was like in her way of working with the mushrooms. And which is and again a kind of bridge to Sam's presentation, very different than a understanding of a psychedelic experience in the way that the Richard's pancake mystical scale that was used by the John Hopkins Project for their study of mushrooms and mystical experience, a very different understanding of a religiosity, of spirituality, and of healing that is happening through working with the mushrooms. So I just want to pause, and again, I envision the rest of our time together as engaging with the readings, as in conversation with the readings, and I have a Google Doc for us to write notes on together. And also I will share the slides and the link to that recording as well for the coordinators of this to share with you all later. But first, I just want to pause and see what questions are coming up for you, what responses to hearing Maria Sabina's voice, connections you want to make with Sam's presentation, with the readings.
Hi, I have a question.
Hi.
Thank you for including that also. That was really, really great to hear. So Sam asked us to watch a video, and in the video, a participant said that they are trying to reduce the mystical to the therapeutic or to the pharmaceutical in order to kind of show today's modern society the positive uses of psychedelics. So I'm wondering how we use this in trying to persuade Western society while protecting the indigenous peoples and the original uses of psychedelics, because it seems like it's a colonization all over again.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's in some ways the question of this revival, I think, for many of us. I am going to share my slides again, in part to answer that. Actually, maybe I will go to my slideshow and find the slide I'd like to point us to in thinking about that. So yeah, there are a number of very complicated historical, I think, moments converging and colliding right now. And I really appreciate your question in relationship to Sam's talk too, and that Sam has given us these multiple histories to think about as well, right? That on the one hand, we have, a kind of history of Protestantism and how a Protestant sensibility made its way to define our modern era in all kinds of ways. The economic form, which defines our collective existence, capitalism, a kind of political form, which is liberalism, which has to do with the kind of government we have that includes Democrats and Republicans and libertarians and so forth, but but a liberal government and a liberal economic system is one that privileges the kind of place of the individual, representation, the right of us to vote as individuals, for people to represent us, and so forth, and a separation of church and state. So there are all kinds of ways that that history matters in this current psychedelic revival, including, as Sam said, in the clinical trial space, a kind of Protestant sense of spirituality has come to define, has been a marker of someone has had a mystical experience. I'm bringing another history as well, the history of how Gordon Wasson visited the town of Maria Sabina, brought the mushrooms back to the United States. This publication in Life magazine that spread news of the mushrooms to the world, how that impacted this village. And so those are just two of the many. And the third one here too is the war on drugs in the U.S. and the way in which the psychedelics moved out of clinical spaces in the 60s into the broader culture around the world, and then were suppressed legally and in all kinds of other ways. So the space of the clinical trials is influenced by all these histories as well, and so the safety has been such a key component of the current psychedelic renaissance. The clinical trials are trying to keep things safe and contained in order to take psychedelics through an FDA process, which I'm sure you've been hearing about in prior. So you're very familiar with the process and the constraints of that process, right? And the FDA process is one that's purely wants to keep things in prevailing biomedical neuroscientific frameworks, right? And that's the constraint. And so as part of that, there's all kinds of practices of psychedelic use that do and do not fit. And there's no doubt that indigenous practices and ways of understanding how to safely do psychedelics are very much part of the clinical spaces. And they're also excluded in a lot of ways as well. And so again, it's a key question, I think, and I will share slide. The slides now, we have a convergence of things happening in this current psychedelic renaissance. We have, and the slide is meant to bring in some of these different converging movements. We have corporate entities like Compass Pathways. I'm sure many of you have heard of Compass. Compass Pathways is a large biomedical pharmaceutical-based company whose practices have been called out as seriously unethical over the last couple of years. They are the first company to go public on the US market. I think it was on the NASDAQ last September. Their initial valuation was something like 500 million, and by the end of their first week, the company was already valued at $1 billion. There's huge money right now in psychedelics, and Compass has become a kind of symbol of all that is wrong with corporate psychedelic, the corporate psychedelic world. We have this clinical trial world. The Hefter Research Institute is an institute of private funding that has specifically been focusing on psilocybin research. And Compass also is focusing on psilocybin research, and they are at some level in competition against each other at this point. And then you have movements like the Decriminalize Nature Oakland movement, which has since, Decriminalize began in 2018. A group of citizens in Oakland who lobbied successfully for the city of Oakland by city council vote to name not all scheduled drugs, but those that have psychoactive properties and have derived from natural sources. that they be considered low priority for law enforcement in the city of Oakland. And many cities around the country have followed suit. A lot of issues have come up around decriminalized Metro Oakland, including why is there a focus on decriminalizing psychoactive substances that are natural? Why not decriminalize all drugs? Why not have the focus be there? You know, heroin, cocaine, etc. were not included on this list, and so there's a lot of issues to think about. Another issue here is that this. Does anyone know what this symbol is? What it's meant to represent? It's a flower of something. It's the button of the peyote plant. Oh, why is that significant? Any guesses? Why this would have been a source of been an issue for certain communities? Does anyone know or have any thoughts on that? So peyote is a plant that is endangered and is also central to a tradition of indigenous use of peyote that began at the end of the 19th century in the period of cultural genocide and physical community genocide of many indigenous communities in the United States. And so the Native American Church was founded in this moment of genocide. And peyote is the sacrament. And there's been a long struggle of the Native American Church to have legal access to peyote. So it infuriated many indigenous communities, and especially Native practitioners in the Native Indigenous Church, that peyote would have been included on this list, and also that there was the use of this image in their logo. Decriminalize has since, I think, removed peyote, but there's still a lot of tension between the decriminalized movement and the Native American Church organizations around the country. So these are it's an incredibly fraught moment. Again, many of these traditions, legacies are colliding, generating new things. And alongside this are many collaborations with Indigenous as well. And have you all had Francoise Borzat come to see you yet? Yeah. So this is one tradition, one kind of long-standing collaboration between Francoise and a family in Mola de Jimenez, which was also where Maria Sabina was from. And I want to, let me find it. There's an institute called the Chakuna Institute. And they are a website that offers a lot of great articles, guidelines for seeking out the psychedelic practice. And they have a whole conference coming up in a few weeks that is dedicated to thinking about Indigenous knowledge and the role of a psychedelic revival. So it's, again, a very fraught, complicated question. The question of there are many collaborations. There are many collaborations that are that some people find highly problematic, and again, it's a fraught moment, and I think that we are really in the thick of something. It is an incredibly historic moment that we are part of, and things are evolving and emerging really fast. I began my fieldwork in 2016, and in that time, the landscape of the psychedelic world has radically changed. And so, I invited you to read Gloria Anzaldua's piece from her book Borderlands. This is not a piece about psychedelic use or spirituality or religion. I don't know if she ever engaged in that kind of practice, but it's a rich. And thank you, Johnny, for mentioning the scholarships that are available. And I highly encourage you to check out that conference. So this is the Google Doc that I prepared for us today. It's very simple. It just lists some questions, and I can put those also in the chat for us. Let me put the first one in the chat. This reading, Gloria Anzaldua's reading, invokes these multiple histories of the world of the Aztecs before the coming of the Spanish, the coming of Cortez to the New World. She describes, the different kinds of the history of the Aztecs and the way this history results in a shift of the mythology of the Aztecs, of the place of this goddess, Coatlicue. And I wanted also to show you an image of Coatlicue. This statue is in Mexico City, in the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. So there she is, and you can see here, this is the belt of serpents and the serpent heads with the fangs here. This is the head of the goddess is these two serpents. This is a human skull, parts of human limbs and so forth. So, again, just connecting to Sam, this, the Aztec tradition was a mushroom using tradition. And the story of Guadalupe is that she appeared to an indigenous man, Juan Diego, who was presumably on mushrooms and visiting the sacred hill where this goddess was known. It was known to be her hill. And she appeared, the Aztec earth goddess appeared to him as Guadalupe. And the story of Guadalupe, she gifted him roses and instructed him to take these to the Spanish. He collected them, and then when he unfurled them to give them to the Spanish, it was her image that appeared. And this is what ended the slaughter of the Indians, that Guadalupe facilitated, this kind of bridging of the two worlds that Gloria Anzaldúa writes about. So again, this is not transcendent white light. This is a belt of snakes and human limbs and fangs and so forth. And so, bringing in this history that Gloria Anzaldúa is remembering as what she calls in that chapter presences, like echoes of the past that make their way in. They interrupt into her present life, the life of her community, her own spiritual explorations as someone living on the Texas-Mexico border. The chapters in English, the chapters in Mexican Spanish. She's constantly navigating between the worlds. And there's one particular passage that is very key for us, and then I promise we'll get to discussion. Thank you, Nicole, for starting us off. So again, thinking about what Sam shared with us, this comparison that happened in the colonial project between different forms of spirituality. Let's go to this passage and read it together. So she describes a snake crossing her path, and these spirits that come. And she says, we're not supposed to remember such otherworldly events. We're supposed to ignore, forget, kill those fleeting images of the soul's presence and of the spirit's presence. We've been taught that the spirit is outside our bodies, or above our heads somewhere up in the sky with God. And this is that Protestant notion that Sam was talking about. We're supposed to forget that every cell in our bodies, every bone and bird and worm has spirit in it. Like many Indians and Mexicans, I did not deem my psychic experiences real. I denied their occurrences and let my inner senses atrophy. I allowed white rationality to tell me that the existence of the other world was mere pagan superstition. I accepted their reality, the official reality of the rational, reasoning mode, which is connected with external reality, the upper world, and is considered the most developed consciousness, the consciousness of duality. The other mode of consciousness facilitates images from the soul and unconscious through dreams and the imagination. Its work is labeled fiction, make-believe, wish fulfillment. White anthropologists claim that Indians have primitive and therefore deficient minds, that we cannot think in the higher mode of consciousness, rationality. They are fascinated by what they call the magical mind, the savage mind, the participation mystique of the mind that says the world of the imagination, the world of the soul and of the spirit is just as real as physical reality. In trying to become objective, Western culture made objects of things and people when it distanced itself from them, thereby losing touch with them. This dichotomy is the root of all violence. Not only was the brain split into two functions, but so is reality. Thus, people who inhabit both realities are forced to live in the interface between the two, forced to become adept at switching modes. Such is the case with the India and the Mexica. And she goes on here to discuss how certain Catholic and Protestant religious forms discourage other kinds of engagement with spirit that she's describing here. And then on the next page, she describes what she calls as something insurgent, la facultad, a faculty, the faculty, this capacity to see in the surface phenomenon the meaning of deeper realities, to see the deep structure below the surface. It is an instant seeing, a quick perception arrived at without conscious reasoning. And she said that, those who are pushed out of the tribe, who are marginalized, some kind of violence is inflicted upon them, are more likely to develop this. And she encourages this kind of faculty at the same time as recognizing faculty comes with the loss of something. It's not an easy thing. We lose something in this mode of initiation. Something is taken from us, our innocence, our unknowing ways, our safe and easy ignorance. There's a prejudice and a fear of the dark, chthonic underworld, material such as depression, illness, death, and the violations that can bring on this break. Confronting anything that tears the fabric of our everyday mode of consciousness and that thrusts us into this less literal and more psychic sense of reality increases awareness and la facultad. And so again, just bridging with Sam here, for many people, psychedelic experience brings about something close to what Gloria Anzaldúa is describing here. It's an eruption of something. It's a coming into contact with sensing, with seeing, with visioning in ways that don't easily fit into forms of established religion or of rationality and so forth. And this can be quite a disjuncture. This can be quite difficult, challenging to engage, as Sam said at the beginning of his presentation, another level of reality which does not conform to the consensus one is not often an easy thing. And so I think we're really in a moment in the psychedelic revival of learning how to work with these things, of learning how to, in a moment in which the colonial kind of project eradicated many of these traditions, many of these ways of knowing, seeing, working with things. As you saw on the slides, there was a long suppression of these traditions in the world. In Europe, there was many centuries of inquisition, of suppressing healing with plants and plant medicines and ways of knowing outside of the church and the emerging modern science. And so it's a real question for us now in this revival, what to do with these practices that come through for people in their psychedelic use, how to engage with Indigenous communities that preserved something of this knowledge, have passed it on in ways that are respectful and don't repeat, as Nicole was saying, just the kind of colonial relations that Wasson did with Maria Sabina. So we're really in this moment, and there is a lot to talk and think about and collectively work on together. So, okay, I didn't mean to talk so long. Let's let me go to that Google Doc. So the questions, and I invite you now, what did you learn from the readings? What did you think and feel about them? What troubles you, interests you, confuses you, and what passages spoke to you? Would you like us to discuss together? And then the second set of questions, how does this knowing these multiple histories that we talked about today shift your expand your understanding of psychedelics and science, as well as psychedelics and religion and spirituality? Let me also put that second question in the chat. So I invite you all to write answers to these in the Google Doc. You all have it. And even after today, or after our time together today, I invite you to reflect and think, and maybe I'll wait until tomorrow to kind of make a PDF of this Google Doc so that everyone has time to offer some thoughts. But for now, please, what are some answers that you have? What came up for you in the reading of these pieces?
It was interesting for me reading a bit about the like growth of the Aztec people and just kind of like how militaristic they were, how patriarchal they were, and things like that. And then, as you mentioned in what you're talking about today, that they were a mushroom-using people. And so, I guess what comes up for me is how did they engage with mushrooms? Was it similar to how Maria Sabina did, like so many centuries later, as something they used to heal people, or did it also have to do somehow with their spiritual framework that had to have something to do with kind of their like very militaristic political system? But that, yeah, that's what came up for me.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's a very good question, and my understanding is that it is both. And let me in the slide that I showed, let me share the screen here. This is the Lord of the Underworld. That is giving the taker of the mushrooms, that is communing with the taker of the mushrooms. And that, yes, the god of war is associated with the mushroom tradition, and that the tradition of using mushrooms that came as it was just before the Spanish ride, and that became well documented by the missionaries. And so, also there's much that we don't know because it was lost and suppressed. But I think this very much relates to Sam's point earlier, that some of the mid 20th century writers of the mid 20th century English and British writers, such as Aldous Huxley, who kind of created a canon for us of about psychedelic experience. These include this Huxley and Houston Smith. Houston Smith was a scholar of religion that actually taught at the DTU, where Sam teaches now. They did have this kind of vision of that was very much informed by a Protestant understanding of religion as good, true religion, as something that kind of lent itself to these mystical experiences. Now, what you did with them when you came back, Houston Smith was very famous for saying, it's very easy to have maybe one of these huge experiences, peak experiences, but how that translates in daily life is a different thing. But they did have an understanding of a kind of core mystical religious experience. And this again is the idea of the perennial philosophy. And this has really influenced the way, certainly, like the psychedelic science and the trials are being undertaken. But for any of you who know anything about shamanic practices in the New World, and especially the ayahuasca traditions and the mushroom ones too, these are traditions where evil is present as much as good, and psychedelics are very much a world of demons and evil influences and sorcery as much as healing. In our own time, there is a lot of conversation right now after the QAnon shaman of thinking about the relationship between psychedelics and fascism, and psychedelics and far-right groups. There are a number of different resources and interesting things to think about there. Let me find one good article for you to look at. And while I'm looking for that, any other questions? Thoughts, responses to the readings that you want to share? And again, this is a link to a short article by Nicholas Linglitz called "Right as Psychedelic." Nicholas Linglitz, is he coming to the decal? He is an extraordinary scholar, and he wrote a great book called Neuropsychedelia, which looks at some of, he's an anthropologist and wrote a great book thinking about clinical science around psychedelics, as well as perennial philosophy. Don't be shy, we only have a few more minutes, so other thoughts. I am curious what came up for you while doing the reading in relation to your own sense of psychedelic science, psychedelic spirituality, how these readings, what they opened up for you, what they shifted for you. Johnny, I see your hand.
Yeah, this is kind of a general question. Thanks for the talk, by the way. But my question is, how much of psychedelics and psychedelia is the drugs? And how much is everything else, in your opinion? I put this in the doc, but it's something I'd like to hear your opinion about.
Yeah, can I ask you, why does that matter to you? What would the answer to that mean?
I'm not sure. I think it's almost, I was thinking about this earlier, it's almost like a painting where how much of the painting is the artist and the paint and the canvas and the brushes, and how much of it is the painting itself. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I think people who studied it more have.
Thank you. I love what you said about the painting, right? And thinking you can think of the painting as an object that stands alone, and you can think of the painting as so many other things, right? That were produced through the painter, and perhaps the coffee the painter had, and the paints, and how those paints were manufactured, and the whole like chain, right? And the kind of moment the painter lives in which their style is in conversation with the dominant artistic styles at the time. And so these are, I think these are different ways of envisioning artistic practice, and then maybe an object that comes out of that, and who authors the painting. And I think it's sort of the same, as Sam spoke about, set and setting are crucial here, and so you have these very powerful beings or substances or drugs. Again, even the names for them shifts from place and time and so forth. And so I think it is a real question for us in this moment, we have psychedelics as commodities. We have psychedelics as drugs to treat clinical symptoms for depression, addiction, and so forth. We have psychedelics as beings, as living entities and intelligences with powers of their own, right? And healing powers of their own that channel. They're the little saints children, Niños Santo, right? That bring to Maria Sabina the vision of the book and bring the saints to speak through her. And so it is a crucial question you're asking, and how we answer it will also, frame what these are to us and the kind of practices that matter to us. And I want to leave you. Oh, that's not the one. That's again the article by Nick Langlet. It's about psychedelics and fascism. I want to leave you with one last link, and again, I'll make sure that you get all these links. I'll send them to the organizers. This is an article about spirituality. There wasn't room to include it. By David Delgado Shorter, and it's a critique of our notions of spirit and spirituality that are based on Protestant understandings of that. And he offers a different way, especially in thinking about indigenous religions, in which spirituality is based on relation. And so, Johnny, I think in some ways the best answer to your question is, what kind of relationships do we seek to have with these with psychedelics? And for those of you who have taken David Presti's classes, he encourages us to think of drugs as pharmacons, medicines, and poisons. And the question here is dose and relationship. How do we relate to them? And here, I highly recommend reading Dale Pendle's Pharmaco series. So my answer is to reframe what you're saying, to think about the kind of networks of relationships that we have with these drugs, commodities, substances, plants, beings, intelligences. And my final thing I'll say, I wish there was so much more time for conversation, is to sit with these histories that both Sam and I, and those that we have, the readings, Pasha Foudry and Maria Sabina and Gloria Anzaldúa, these many different histories that are sort of gurgling up and are very much part of our moment and are informing our moment. It's a lot of things colliding, bubbling up, and again, it is such an exciting and dangerous moment in terms of what is to come.
Well, thank you very, very much, Patricia. It's been really, really great listening to you.
Thank you. And again, I will share those slides and links, and we'll leave that Google Doc open for people to add comments until the end of today, and I'll send that on to all the organizers tomorrow.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. This was really awesome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Take care. Thank you
so much. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.